This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good day. We're coming on the air with breaking news. Sources inform NBC News that Vice President Kamala Harris has selected Tim Walz as her running mate. Harris is now informing the contenders. This makes the Democratic ticket official. Harris-Walz heading into the party convention later this month. Tim Walz, the governor, popular two-term governor, elected in 2018. He is a former high school teacher and former coach who went on to represent Minnesota in Congress for 12 years. The 60-year-old also served for more than 2 decades in the Army National Guard. Harris and Walz will appear together for the first time later today at a rally in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Let's bring in our chief White House correspondent, Peter Alexander. Peter, what do we know about Tim Walz and this decision-making process?
Lester, we know that we're going to see him for the first time on stage alongside Kamala Harris just a matter of hours from now after we get the formal unveiling from the campaign, expected to happen early this morning. That event will happen here in Philadelphia. Notably, another vice presidential potential pick, Josh Shapiro, Pennsylvania's governor, will also be in attendance. To give you a little better understanding about Tim Walz right now, he is a popular 2-term governor. Among other things, he sort of checks that box of what we have been reporting that Kamala Harris was looking for a governing partner who served 12 years in Congress. Notably, he's one of the rare Democrats who represented a rural community in Minnesota. It's part of that plain-spoken style that, as we understand it, may have appealed to Kamala Harris right now. Among the desires for her going forward is to try to secure that critical blue wall, the key states of Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan as well. The hope, according to those close to this process, is that she, with him at her side, will be able to help secure those key battleground states. Without them, certainly without Pennsylvania, Kamala Harris cannot win the presidential race. So beyond the rural appeal, he is also the Democratic Governors Association's head. He leads that organization of governors across the country right now, and he did make an impression on the Harris team over the course of what has been a rapid-fire vetting process. It was Walz himself who first used that word weird to describe not Republicans, but Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, the ticket, a phrase, a word that ultimately we saw many others throughout the Democratic Party, some of Vice President Harris's own surrogates using in the days that followed. Lester, just to pull back the curtain for a second, I'm told by a source familiar with this process that as of late last night, Kamala Harris, the vice president, had not yet made up her mind that she wanted to sleep on it for another night. And to give you a better understanding of how this was going down to the wire, the campaign, the Harris campaign, had printed signs, a variety of different signs that they could use no matter who she picked, with her name on top and a variety of different names beneath it. Joe Biden notably did the same. He had signs for 12 possible scenarios made back in 2020. But again, that's the most information we have at this time as we learn more about Tim Walz right now. In our conversations with those familiar with this process, there were sort of 3 C's that she had been looking for. She wanted someone that demonstrated competence, someone that also had shared sort of a personal chemistry with her and, frankly, with her husband, Doug Emhoff, who had participated in a lot of this process as well, and also someone who they felt very strongly could help secure some of those key states going forward. As we noted, Minnesota, not a state that the Democrats are worried about, a state that the Democratic Party has not lost since 1972, but some of those key neighbors, including Wisconsin right next door, Michigan and Pennsylvania, are obviously key for her. We're going to be watching this over the course of the morning. Lester, will keep you posted as we gather more from our sources.
All right, Peter Alexander, we'll ask you to stand by. Thanks. Tim Walz may not be a name those outside of Minnesota are familiar with up until today. NBC's Gabe Gutierrez has more on his background.
A working-class politician from a rural background, Minnesota's Tim Walz is known for not pulling punches.
This is not about the Second Amendment. This is about the safety of our children and our communities.
A self-described white dude for Kamala Harris, the popular governor will now run alongside the nation's first woman of color atop a major party's ticket. Walz grew up in small-town Nebraska and joined the National Guard as a teenager. He'd serve in the National Guard for more than 2 decades, eventually becoming a school teacher. After moving to Minnesota, he volunteered for John Kerry's presidential campaign, and in an upset, he was elected to Congress in 2006. Walz served in Washington for the next 12 years, establishing himself as a moderate Democrat. Then he ran for governor in 2018, winning in a landslide.
The process of how we as a state and how we as a nation respond to these things is really important.
2020 would bring defining moments, the COVID pandemic and the killing of George Floyd, which triggered riots and criticism from Republicans over why it took Walz 3 days to call in the National Guard.
Decisions were made in a situation that is what it is, and I simply believe that we tried to do the best we can.
Walz's critics also point to a state audit report that found major failures by Minnesota's education department during the pandemic, allowing rampant misuse of a federal program meant to feed children.
If you commit fraud in Minnesota, you are going to be caught and you are going to go to prison.
Still, Walz has long had strong union support. The president of the United Auto Workers says he was among his top choices for VP.
I had an opponent who thought this was a real zinger when we were going at it. He said, Governor Walz is in the pocket of organized labor. And I said, that is a damn lie. I am the pocket.
Walz is also seen as an attack dog, not shy about going after former President Trump or his running mate, Senator J.D. Vance.
Well, it's true. These guys are just weird. And it's, you know, they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club or something.
Now, the plain-spoken 60-year-old governor from the Midwest is set to join a historic national ticket. Gabe Gutierrez, NBC News.
Bring in our senior Washington correspondent, Hie Jackson. Now, Hie, obviously, Republicans doing their homework right now, trying to figure out how to run against Governor Walz. What are you hearing?
Well, they've done their homework apparently pretty quickly, Lester, because we're already hearing now some reaction from the Trump camp going after Tim Walz for essentially his record, the policies that he put in place, that he backed as a member of Congress and that he put in place as governor of Minnesota, linking him to what they call the Biden-Harris agenda on immigration, on gun legislation, on climate, for example, and describing the newly named now Harris-Walz ticket as a team of radicals. That's a quote now from Team Trump. This is not altogether unexpected, as Peter has laid out. There had been some, what you might call, Walz-mentum that had been in play over the course of the last week or so. Some talk about what Tim Walz could bring to the ticket, what he could do for Vice President Kamala Harris, as she is now officially on the top of the ticket on the Democratic side. Keep in mind his policy record. As governor of Minnesota, he, for example, signed some gun safety laws into place in 2023, as Gabe mentioned. On abortion rights, he has been somebody who signed a law that enshrined those in the state of Minnesota. He has been out front on things like universal free school lunch meals as well. These are some of the issues that progressives have really liked from Tim Walz. And that's what makes him so interesting here, Lester, because on the one hand, he has the backing of people like Bernie Sanders, like Pramila Jayapal, head of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. But on the other hand, you're seeing some talk from those in the Midwest about his rural credentials, if you will, having grown up in Nebraska, the way that they believe he can connect with people like those rural exurban voters in some of those so-called Rust Belt critical battleground states, as well as his background as a veteran, somebody who can speak to that community and relate to that group of voters as well. Now, there is some consternation, I think, that you're also seeing on the Republican side, and some of this may be trying to, you know, inject some chatter into the atmosphere there of the idea that Kamala Harris passed over Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, popular governor in that state, which is a critical battleground. Pennsylvania is a must-win for either side here coming up in November. And Shapiro outpolls President Biden in that state. He has done well in Pennsylvania. There had been some concern. He is more moderate. There had been some concern on the progressive side about Governor Shapiro. Although, again, you know, he is somebody who is expected to back the Harris ticket and to still be a part of campaigning for Harris. But when you look at those two states, Minnesota hasn't gone red since 1972. That state has backed a Democrat in the presidential election now for decades. It is not considered a quote-unquote traditional swing state, although you sort of always see Republicans the last couple of cycles say maybe they'll try to play there. You saw former President Trump there just recently as well. So Tim Walz, now the pick, as NBC News is reporting. We expect to see both him and the vice president later on tonight in Philly, Lester, for what is a critical moment in this campaign.
All right, Hie, thanks very much. Tim Walz spent more than a decade in Congress. Our Capitol Hill correspondent Ryan Nobl joins us now. What more can you tell me about his time in Congress?
Well, Lester, this is certainly a characteristic of Tim Walz's career that will be very beneficial to Kamala Harris. This is an individual who spent more than a decade as a member of the House of Representatives in the not-too-distant past. He left Congress in 2019, and so he has the added advantage of being an executive in a Midwestern state while at the same time understanding how Washington works. And he's developed a number of relationships with congressional leaders on both sides of the aisle during his time in the House of Representatives. And it's also important to keep in mind that there is a history of presidential tickets, including members of the House of Representatives. In fact, you have to go back to the 1940s to find a time where there wasn't at least one person on the ticket, either Republican or Democrat, who had at least spent some time in the House of Representatives. So Tim Walz continues that streak by being added to Kamala Harris's ticket as well. He is someone who is considered affable, somebody who can get along with people, even people that he disagrees with. And that may be important to Kamala Harris as she looks for a governing partner and what heads into what her term could ultimately be if she is successful in November. There is a real possibility that there will be divided government in Washington, regardless of who wins the presidential race. There is a very tight contest in the House of Representatives. All 435 seats will be up. And the Senate, the map favors Republicans versus Democrats. So there's a possibility that Democrats may not control either house. They may only control one house. And so it will be beneficial to Kamala Harris, who did spend time in the Senate, but not that much time, to have someone like Tim Walz who understands how the legislative process works and what it will take to push through key agenda items that Kamala Harris and he care about. Now, Walz is someone who does have the benefit of having a lot of support among the progressive members of the Democratic Party. As Hallie rightly points out, the chair of the Progressive Caucus and others are big supporters of Walz, but at the same time, he also has good relationships with members of the moderate wing of the party as well. So he is the type of person that could bring both sides together when the Democratic Party is looking to unify at a key time. So someone who understands what's happening in the middle of America as a Midwestern governor, Lester, but someone who also understands the inner workings of Washington, someone poised to be a very good governing partner for Kamala Harris, and that seems to be at least part of her calculation in selecting Tim Walz as her running mate. Lester?
Okay, Ryan, thanks. I want to bring in our senior and national political reporter, Jonathan Allen. Jonathan, we're about 2 weeks away from the Democratic convention. How does this pick now align this party and how to move forward?
Well, I think there are a couple of ways, Lester, that it aligns Democrats. Number one, as Ryan was attesting to, this is someone that's very familiar to Democratic activists, to the Democratic core. He'll have to be introduced, I think, to the broader set of the electorate within the party and outside the party. But Tim Walz is very experienced as a campaigner. I also think there's a little sub-rosa thing going on here, Lester, which is Democrats have been having difficulty because of President Biden and Vice President Harris's position on Israel. They've been having difficulty with Arab voters, with Muslim voters, most notably in Michigan. Tim Walz is somebody who's been elected in a state with a significant Muslim population that is very much behind him and has appreciated his governorship. And that's something that they may be able to tout as they go forward, somebody who has that relationship as Democrats try to bring back some of those voters.
Is he going to be a unifying force within the party?
Oh, absolutely, Lester. Here's somebody who is basically a progressive but has been able to win over a significant number of independent and Republican voters in his own state. And that's something that will, if he's not the exciting candidate on the ticket, I think that's going to be fine with Kamala Harris. She's bringing that energy. But absolutely somebody that will assure a lot of Democrats, both Midwesterners and moderates, and also the progressives.
Jonathan Allen, thanks. Let's bring back our senior Washington correspondent, Hie Jackson. Hallie, what do we know about how voters feel about Tim Walz?
So this is an interesting one, Lester, and the answer seems to be they don't know yet, because if you look at some recent numbers out of ABC News Ipsos, about 90%, 87% of Americans just within the last week or so here say they just don't know enough about the Minnesota governor to be able to form an opinion. That's not altogether surprising, Lester. If you don't live in Minnesota and if you're not an avid reader of all, Democratic Governors Association press releases, you might not know a lot about Tim Walz until recently when he sort of burst onto, I want to say, the national scene. He's been on there for a while for political observers, but we're talking about sort of regular folks who are now engaging 90-plus days out from the election in November. In Minnesota, he's had an approval rating of 54%. He's never had a net negative rating. What's interesting here is also the way that you're already seeing now both sides try to define who Tim Walz is. For an American population now with whom he's largely an unknown to them, if you will, Lester. So look at it this way. You've got the Harris team now coming out. You've got backers already. We're hearing a couple of, winks and nods from, for example, Amy Klobuchar, the Minnesota senator, who obviously knows a thing or two about what it's like to run for president, suggesting that today may be a good day for Minnesota. Obviously, the Harris campaign has not made this pick officially official. This is our reporting based on what sources are telling us. But you are going to see the Harris campaign look to define Tim Walz as somebody who can, as John has said, as Ryan and Peter have said, be somebody who can relate to those sort of Midwestern voters, but also to progressives who like the policies that he's put in place. It is the flip when you look at Republicans. And there's this quote that's already getting some attention now from the more conservative side of the aisle, in which within the last week or so, the governor, on a campaign call for Harris, said, don't ever shy away from our progressive values. He said, one person's socialism is another person's neighborliness. You're already seeing Republicans jump on that and run with it, if you will. Walz himself is not running away from his past. He talked about just recently how he is the chair of the DGA, the Democratic Governors Association, and he is drawing that link between Democratic governors and the Biden-Harris agenda. He has said that governors, largely Democratic governors, have run on the Biden-Harris administration agenda in a way that has improved lives. And so I think that gives you a sense of what we might hear from him as we move forward now, and as all eyes are going to be on what we'll see tonight in Philly, Lester.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.